We often talk about mental health and diversity, equity and inclusion as two separate conversations, but the reality is that they are interwoven and often the same experience. If one is not included, it can have so many negative impacts on your mental health. And of course, if one is included, the reverse is true. My guest today is a global spokesperson, ambassador, advocate for diversity, equity and inclusion. She is an inspiring individual, a former Paralympian and children's author. My guest is also a judge for the Mentl Awards 2023, which aims to hero companies, public and private sector, industries, individuals, projects, anyone who is trying to help people thrive and tackle the stigma of mental health. So to my guest on the Mental Space today, Jessica Smith, welcome to the Mental Space podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, normally I like to try and sum up someone's story, but your story is so inspiring. I'd like you to basically walk us through it, but I'm going to do it kind of almost in reverse order.
Okay.
Would you mind telling me who Jessica Smith is today?
Yeah, so I work in the space of diversity and inclusion, in particular around disability inclusion. And when I say I work in that space, it means that I run workshops for corporate clients, but I also, as you mentioned, have a children's book series which also highlights the issues around disability inclusion. So I do a lot of work with young children, a lot of work with adolescents around body acceptance and mental health. And so it really is the same message, but I've been able to articulate it in a way that I can deliver it to a range of audiences and people of all ages, wanting to highlight the importance of mental health and exactly as you said, how that is enmeshed in inclusivity and wanting to feel as though we belong in any environment or community.
So that's Jessica Smith today. So the slightly longer version of how you got to today, former Paralympian swimmer, growing up. Take us back to your first experiences.
So I was born in Australia missing my left arm, and even to this day we don't know why that occurred. It was just one of those unfortunate things. But the doctors advised my parents from day one to have me fitted with a prosthetic limb to help aid my growth and development and to help me fit in with society. And so, of course, my parents wanted to give me the best start at life. And so at 18 months of age, I was fitted with my first fake arm. The technology back in the early 80s is nothing like what it is today. And so it was more like a contraption, and it only held onto my arm because it had sort of straps that wrapped around my entire body. Yeah. And it was difficult for me to get used to. And unfortunately, one morning I was in the kitchen, my mum was making morning tea, and being a curious toddler, I noticed a plate of biscuits up on the bench. And so I wandered over, and with my new amazing arm, I reached up to grab a biscuit. But because I couldn't feel or detect heat, I didn't realise that I had knocked a freshly boiled teapot in the same process. And as I looked up, I spilt boiling water onto myself, just sustaining third-degree burns to 15% of my body, predominantly my neck and chest. I'm very lucky that it didn't splash onto my face. But in that process and that moment of panic, my mum wanted to take the arm off, and I know it's quite graphic, but all of my clothes came off and so did all of my skin. I was rushed to Sydney Children's Hospital and underwent skin grafting and, immediate surgery. And I was in and out of hospital for about 2 or 3 years. And so growing up with prominent scarring and missing my left arm, I knew I was different. I have 3 younger brothers who are all relatively close in age. And, I saw other children at the park and at school, and I knew very early on that I was different. And I can remember from as young as 5 sort of questioning that identity and why did I look different? Because I was very aware that other people knew I was different as well. The points and the stares and the giggling and the questions and the statements, mainly from adults, I want to say. And I just remember feeling very embarrassed and very shy. But deep down there was some burning desire to push back and to be able to give myself a voice, whatever that sort of looked like, to be able to say, I don't want to be limited by my appearance and by my disability. And for me, the obvious way to prove that I wasn't going to be held back by those things and society's understanding of that was to use my body, so through movement and through sport. Growing up in Australia, that was a relatively easy thing to do. So I I played all sorts of sport, but I fell in love with swimming. And I think there was a sense of freedom and exhilaration being in the water. And it was also as if I could drown the sounds out of, the rest of the world being immersed underwater. And I remember my first school swimming carnival at the age of 10. I won the 50 metres freestyle and I beat all the girls and boys with 2 hands. And in that moment, I felt as though I was finally being acknowledged for what I could do rather than the perceived assumptions from others about what I couldn't.
Yeah.
And to be aware of that at the age of 10, I think, made me understand that there was something else at play. It wasn't just I won a race, a swimming race. There was something more powerful. And at the time, I wasn't aware that there were races or events for athletes with a disability. I had no idea what the Paralympic Games were. I just knew that I wanted to swim forever because it made me feel so amazing. And, I said to my mum and dad, I want to start training. And unfortunately for them, that meant early mornings for the next, foreseeable future, driving me to and from the swimming pool. And I excelled very quickly. I was selected to represent Australia at the age of 13 and continued to wear those green and gold colours very proudly for just shy of a decade. And so it was an amazing, phenomenal experience to be able to have a disability, but to be also doing something that showed myself and the rest of the world that I was capable. My disability wasn't stopping me and it wasn't hindering my experiences at life. But that doesn't mean that journey was easy or without stigma or without challenges, because it was actually during that time as an athlete that I faced some of the worst discrimination I've ever experienced in my life as a female athlete with a disability. And it got to the point where I wasn't able to deal with the overwhelming emotions of having to be somebody that looked different in a world that was so obsessed with the way that we look that it did take a toll on my mental health. And I was forced into early retirement from my swimming career because I was struggling with mental illness and eating disorders. And it basically ended my career prematurely. I was forced to retire at the age of 21. And, looking back now, obviously all of those moments have led me to the work that I do today. Yeah. But it was a very, very difficult time. And even in Australia where, we often think they're very, very forward thinking and accepting, I had some of my biggest struggles within the community of sport and just the society growing up in Australia.
Do you mind us going into that a little and asking you, how did that show up? Because you almost assume that before you're the star athlete, that's where people have got that discrimination. But you're saying a lot of this happened while you were representing your own country. Yeah.
And I think even for me, looking back, that's probably the hardest thing and it gets from really simple things such as I remember going to an Australian Championships and the medals that were being awarded to the athletes with a disability were smaller than the medals for the able-bodied athletes. And it sends such a powerful message. Like, why is there a need to do that? Why is there a need to, have something tangible that represents that you're smaller, we're bigger, and this is better? I mean, that was the messaging that I got. And just in terms of sponsorship and not having the same opportunities as able-bodied athletes, and I only ever trained with able-bodied athletes. It was only when I was competing that I was racing against other athletes with a disability. And it was as if we just had to brush it off and laugh at any of the instances where we weren't sort of given those same opportunities. So at the Australian Championships as well with the television broadcast, which was always live, that races for athletes with a disability were either at the very beginning of the program or at the very end, so that we never interfered with what was being shown on television. And, when you're a young athlete and you're so proud and you're so excited to walk out on pool deck as the crowd is leaving because they've been told that the broadcast is over, I mean, there's nothing more diminishing and heartbreaking. Yeah. And for then coaches and officials to say, just deal with it, just get on with it. If you love the sport so much, none of this will impact you. But of course it impacts you, and as a 14, 15-year-old to try and deal with all of that was really, really tough.
Sorry, I'm just trying to get my words in the right order. It's so fascinating because we had Azim Rafiq, who is one of the judges as well for the Mentl Awards 2023, and he blew the whistle on racism within cricket, and he grew up again 14, 15, 16 in the sport, and he talked about how it just, the things you saw every day began to, even if they were little things, began to eat away at him and really began to damage his mental health. And it's kind of like so inclusion or exclusion, it's not one thing, it seems. It's a series of events, as you say, small things which eventually add up.
Yeah.
At what point with your journey with that experience, did it just become too much?
Yeah, well, you're exactly right. It is. It's a compounding look at all of the little things that finally take a toll. So for me, it was, the lack of sponsorship, the lack of financial support, the fact that I had to be studying and working. So the stress of that as well, the stress of always being told that I had to perform. So training, 2 times a day, 6 days a week. So the stress of all of that, the stress of trying to understand the mentality of the coaching staff at the time, and their idea was to break athletes and then try and build them back up. So to understand and to be accepting of that at the time, for me, it took its toll because there were also the social burdens as well. And I often say that sport and society they mirror one another. So whatever's going on, whether that is, racism or exclusion within other minority groups, it is prevalent within sport. Yeah. And I think for athletes, when you know that that's happening on the field or in the pool, but also when you're walking down the street, there's like you're battling it at two sides. And so for me, I completely retreated, and I had swimming as my outlet. And then when it was everything else, I just put myself into my study and into the work that I was doing to try and protect myself. But what happened was, because I wasn't able to talk about it, because I wasn't able to give myself a voice, of course, when you internalize all of those thoughts and feelings, it starts to explode. And for me, because I was living with a disability, I didn't look like the models that I saw on television or in the magazines. I never saw myself represented in a positive way within the media. And so I convinced myself that if I could change what I could control about my body so that my body fit within those parameters of what society says is acceptable or beautiful, maybe then it would counteract the fact that I have a disability and prominent scarring. So just like many other young females, I was battling with my body image. And I told myself, if I could lose just a little bit of weight and if my body was perfect, then maybe people would accept me and then maybe I'd be happy. And so when you're trying to deal with all of that just as an adolescent and then trying to be an athlete, whereas now when you're competing in the open category, you're considered an adult, traveling around the world, they're like, you're an adult now at the age of 13, 14. The expectations were so incredibly overwhelming that trying to manage all of that just became too much. And it was, in fact, my eating disorder that became my sanctuary, because it was what I felt I could control. It was what I felt I was able to hold on to. It was a safety net when everything else was too difficult for me to manage. And as anyone would know, living with an eating disorder, it is controlling you. You have no power over that. And so it was a decade-long battle of mental illness and eating disorders within that swimming career. But the shame and the stigma of mental illness at that time was so difficult. I remember going to the doctors with my mum, and she said, "You can't tell anybody this." I was medicated at the age of 14, and she said, no one can ever know that this is what is going on. So, of course, I was like, okay, well, I'm now on medication to try and balance out all of these emotions and feelings and to try and stop my behaviours around eating disorders and try and compete for my country. But I can't tell anybody, and even my family is telling me how shameful this is. So it all got to a point where I just couldn't. And I had been selected to race at the 2004 Paralympic Games in Athens, which was the highlight of my career. But what many people don't know, I was expected to medal in 3 events. I was the only member of the Australian swimming team to not make a final. And it took me about a decade to even verbalize that because I was so ashamed and so embarrassed. But that was the point in my career where my body had just given up. And I knew then that I had to retire because the environment for me was too toxic to continue.
Basically killing you.
It was killing me. Yeah. And I'm so grateful that I did have enough support. It wasn't a lot of support because I didn't really tell anybody, and I don't feel that the Australian swim team at the time or the Paralympic team had enough resources to be able to, support athletes with mental illness. There was just enough for me to be able to say, I need to walk away from this in order to save my life. And so I returned to Australia and I was admitted to a rehab facility in Sydney for addiction, which I didn't really understand at the time. I was like, I don't have an addiction. Yeah. But with the work of the counsellors and the psychologists and psychiatrists, there was just an understanding that that was my way of coping. And I wasn't coping. So I had held on to these behaviours for so long to be able to get me through what was the toughest time in my life.
What did that healing process look like for you?
Very lonely and dark at the beginning because I was so scared about letting go of something that, even though it was killing me, it was all I had known for such a long time. And there was safety in those behaviours, even though they weren't benefiting me. So having to let go of that and having at the same time shut the door on my identity as a swimmer and just start again and trust that the next step would unfold. I mean, it's absolutely terrifying. And I don't know. I think there was obviously something inside me that just gave me the hope to do that. But it was really difficult because it was relationships, it was friendships, it was everything that I had known that I literally had to say, if I don't walk away from all of this at the moment and try hard to work on my mental health, I won't be here next year. And so I'm grateful that there was just enough light inside to be able to say, no, I don't want to die. Basically.
Where do you think that light came from?
I want to say that it was always there and that I do believe it is inside all of us. We just have to know how to tap into that. And I think now I look back, because often I'm asked, what would I change or do I have any regrets? What would I tell my younger self?
Yeah.
And it's really difficult because I know now that the level of contentment that I feel is because of everything that I've been through. Would I change anything? No, I don't think so. Would I want anyone else to go through that? Absolutely not. However, now as a mother myself, I have 3 young children. I also know that there are some of those hardships that we all have to go through in order to be able to, I guess, train that feeling I was saying and to work on that level of resilience to get to the point where we say, no, I've got enough fight left in me to go just that little bit further when I need to. Having said that, it's a really difficult conversation because I don't believe in this idea that, toughen our children up and they need to be resilient and they need to be put in situations that are really difficult. I don't necessarily believe that's true. However, life is life and it throws all these unexpected... It is going to happen.
Yeah.
So for me as a mother, I know it's going to happen. I don't want to put any extra pressure on my children. I'm here to protect them, but I know that what I've been through is who I am. It is part of me. I haven't walked away from it either. I think that's important because a lot of people talk about we've overcome all of that and we've left all that behind us. No, I haven't left all that behind me. It is part of who I am. Yeah. There's parts of me that are, are broken, but are part of the story. And I live with that knowing that I'm proud that I can actually say that, and that it's not like I've overcome all this adversity and I don't respect or understand that has made me the person I am today.
Those broken parts, that's still a work in progress?
Yes, and it will always be a work in progress. And, I identify that I will always have an eating disorder, even though I've been in recovery for many, many years. It's that same addictive idea of trying to find something to cope with. So obviously now I have different coping mechanisms. I have different ways of being able to work through things, but I have to do that every single day. And it's being able to stop myself from the negative voice inside my head and say, I appreciate that you're there. I understand that also that comes from a protective space, but now I have to let that positive voice come in and tell me that, you know, it's okay, and that who I am and the way that I look is perfectly okay. And years of doing that, and I'll have to do that forever, I think. But I'm no longer looking at those broken pieces having to fix them entirely, because I believe that it allows me to see the world through a different lens, a different perspective, which I'm grateful for, because I think it also helps me to be more empathetic and understanding of the journey that other people are on as well.
One of the things I just wanted to kind of circle back onto, and I know it's a difficult space to be talking about, but I think it's just so important for people to listen and hear, is that isolation you felt. And when you were told, don't talk about it. I mean, at Mentl, all we ever say is actually talk about it, because everyone seems to feel that it's amazing how many people feel that it's something wrong with them, not that it's something normal that everyone goes through. And you actually weren't going through a normal experience. You were going through almost like a hyper experience of all of this. But what do you think it did to you, that inability to talk to people? And what do you say to people now about the importance of opening up?
It certainly prolonged my dark experience, absolutely. And I think that that's one thing that, you know, I'm very aware of now, is exactly as you said, the more we can talk about it, and we talk about it now, and we talk about it proudly and in a safe space, it will shorten that experience for many people. And so, because, you know, I touched on the idea, and we've said we will go through all of these things. And I do think that it is important in many aspects, but if we have a community and a society and an understanding around the world where talking about this in a safe space is going to benefit everybody, it allows us to free ourselves from that. So for me, just not being able to say anything, and as you said, feeling as though I was the only one going through all of this. Obviously now, as I talk about it, there were so many other athletes that I was training side by side that were going through very, very similar experiences, but they too didn't feel they could voice, you know, what they were going through. And if you look at a lot of athletes during the time that I was competing, a lot of them have a very similar story, and a lot of them have had much darker, much longer experiences. And so, of course, we want to prevent all of that. We want to be able to say, hey, we're here to support one another. And I think that, you know, by talking about it is the first step of alleviating so much of that pain for a lot of people, but for also understanding that we're not alone in this, you know, and I think that's part of it. When you feel that you're the only person, and then all of a sudden other people start saying, no, I can identify with that as well. It's that sense of belonging and feeling connected, even in the darkest moments, you know. And I know that for me, when I was finally able to connect with people who had those similar experiences, it just felt as if the weight of the world was lifting from my shoulders.
Have you had the conversation with your mother, with your family, and how has that changed, or does that remain?
It's a very interesting conversation. We've had a few conversations, especially during my time in rehab and in therapy. There was a lot of family involvement, and I now understand and have empathy for their own journeys. And I feel that whatever happened throughout my childhood was not coming from a place of wanting to upset me or make things. My parents practiced very tough love. Their way of approaching it was, no one's going to feel sorry for you, so just get up and get out and do it, which I am grateful for. But there were also times when I wish it was more, I can just give you a hug because I can see, you know, this is something that you're struggling with. But I think now for my mum in particular, the shame and the guilt that she continues to carry, because especially when the accident happened, she was right there. You know, why wasn't she able to stop it? Why couldn't she have helped, you know, prevent that? And I know now as a mother, I think that's what it's taken for me to become a mum, to realise, wow, there's so much pressure on parents, you know, and you cannot get it right. And ever, I don't think, because there's always going to be something where, you know, we've said the wrong thing, or, you know, we haven't been what our child expects us to be in that particular moment.
Yeah.
So I think now I have a lot of understanding for, you know, both of my parents' stories, because they're both very different people as well, and how that has then impacted their way of parenting myself and my 3 younger brothers. So it's given me different perspective, and I know that I will never change either of them. I'm grateful for the way that they did parent at the time with the resources that they had available to them. And I just also have to accept that this is part of the journey.
Yeah.
You know, and we can unpack a lot of, you know, our childhood, and I think it's very important to do that. But in doing that, not looking to change what has happened or the people that have, you know, impacted some of the things we've experienced, being able to understand why that has potentially happened to give us more answers. That's sort of where I'm at.
No. This could turn into a very long therapy session,
Yes,
which
yeah.
I think I need as much as anybody else. How did that time... so what are the kind of the main lessons do you think that you continue to learn from that time then? How has it shaped you?
It's a tough question, because I wish that I had answers, and I wish that there was some sort of, you know, statement that people could take home and this is it, and they can apply. For me, I don't know. I often think, you know, why me? And then I think, well, why not me?
Yeah.
And, I feel that there's also a level of responsibility that I have to pay it forward and to make sure that the words that I use and the way that I act is in a way that my children will be proud, and that I can look back and say everything that's happened to me hasn't been in, you know, for nothing. I can look at all of those different scenarios and all of the trauma and say, well, I've learned from that. I have to be able to learn from that. I have to be able to now move forward and help as many people as I can by sharing that story, and without ego, because that took me a long time as well to be comfortable, because people are like, why don't you share your story more? And I was like, well, why is my story any different from anybody else's? And the reality is it's not. But not many people are afforded the opportunities that I have been, in terms of having the platform to be able to talk about it.
Yeah.
And I think that there's responsibility with that. But I don't know, what are those lessons? I think it's about perseverance, and I think it's about trying to be accepting of what the reality has been for me as a female living with a disability. You know, I could turn around and be angry at the world, but that doesn't serve me, and it doesn't serve anybody else. What can I do to make a difference? How can I be of service to myself and to those around me, so that I can help create, whether it's just, you know, within the neighborhood that I live or the school community for my children. But obviously for me, I want to take it as far as I can. The lessons are just knowing that this is something that we all face every single day, and it's amplified at certain periods of our life, and being able to talk about it more, so that when we're in a situation that is amplified and our mental health is in a state where we feel it's not being prioritized, having enough self-esteem and self-confidence and self-respect to be able to say, I need to prioritize this right now, and I need to make sure I have people around me that understand that and are going to support that. And I think for many years, so many of us didn't have that. And so if I can be that pillar for somebody else, then I need to be.
Do you think things, I mean, you obviously, if you look at it through the lens of sports, because you're still very active in sports, do you think things are getting better? I mean, it's not that long ago where we had, you know, Simone Biles come out and face incredible flack for being incredibly brave. And that, what is that, 2-3 years ago?
It wasn't long ago.
And it wasn't long ago. And, you know, and we've just had, you know, an amazing Women's World Cup, and we're having this conversation now in 2023. It's like, oh yeah, this is actually something that is a good thing, and maybe the sponsors will finally wake up and realise that there is something there that should be supported. So, are you optimistic? Are you frustrated?
A bit of both.
Yeah.
I'm optimistic because you're absolutely right. I mean, we have seen progress and we have seen change. But obviously more needs to be done, you know, and like I said earlier, I feel that society and sport often mirror each other. So whatever is happening on the streets is absolutely happening in sport and vice versa. You know, there's still gender inequality, absolutely. How do we overcome that? We need to be talking about it, but we have to put things in place that are going to result to action and to change within policies and procedures and strategies. And that has to happen. It's worth it. We need to be working towards that. Yes, there's frustration because I know, I mean, there was a World Government Summit recently in Australia that I was part of around gender equality, but how sport can help progress that. It won't happen in our lifetime. It won't happen in our children's lifetime. That's devastating. But that to me means the fight is so much worth it now.
Absolutely.
Because I need to make sure that the path has been paved for my children and for my grandchildren.
Yeah.
Because there have been so many trailblazers before us, especially when it comes to gender equality, who didn't have this particular platform. You know, faces we don't know, voices, your names we are unaware of, but they did, and they got us to this point. So for me, it's like I have to be grateful, and I have to make sure that I do what I can in this lifetime.
We do have the opportunity to accelerate
Absolutely.
the conversation.
We do.
You know,
So
we can triple it, you know, 3x it, 5x it, 10x it.
Yeah.
Particularly, as you say, I mean, I've got a 7-year-old daughter who is smarter and brighter than I ever was at that age.
Absolutely.
And again, it's like, it's still frustrating. It's like, why, when she gets to working age, she's going to be entering a world like, we absolutely have to do this for our children. Yeah. I still don't understand as a father why we are where we are.
No, I know. And I think, but there's also something positive from that younger generation who are growing up now in a society where perhaps these conversations are allowing them to think in ways that we didn't know was possible, you know, at that same age. And so I have a 7-year-old daughter as well, and she's smarter than me now. Yeah. And I love that, and I want to empower that. Yeah. And I think that that's why as parents and as adults in this generation, we have a huge responsibility. Yeah. We cannot turn around and think, I should have done more, I should have done better. To me, that's not okay. And I think that what is wonderful is that this, you know, Gen Z or wherever we're up to now, they're the ones who are challenging us. Yeah. And they're giving us these questions. Why haven't we been talking about this? And so what I hope to see is that we invite them to really be part of the conversations that we're having and then make sure that they stay at that particular table and conversation.
It's funny because there's a word that always gets used to kind of diminish Gen Z and diminish the younger generation. They go, oh, they're so entitled. But actually, when you think about it, it's like, actually, we're all entitled. We are entitled to feel included. Yes, absolutely. To feel psychologically safe, to be mentally well, you know, to have good mental health. So actually, the fact that they're standing up for their entitlements is not a negative thing. It's actually just something. It's funny because, again, I have worked for managers who look at the kids today and go, well, we were miserable, they should be miserable too. It's like, how is that a good starting point for anyone?
Exactly. Why? It shouldn't be like that. And I think,
why can't we let go of it?
Exactly. And that then goes back to our own biases and our own understandings and perspectives that perhaps we haven't challenged enough. Mm-hmm. Because if we're getting defensive and if we're feeling uncomfortable with the younger generation asking more questions about mental health and we're saying, oh, I can't go there right now, good on them. And we need to empower that as much as we can because look where we are at the moment. It's not okay. Yeah. We have so many people who are suffering. We don't want that for our children. So we need to make sure that when we ask them, okay, well, how are you feeling? What ideas have you got? That we then say, okay, show us how you think this will work for you, rather than us saying, you know, be the leaders that we want our children to be. Instead of saying, okay, now we know better. Thank you for that little bit of input. We'll take it from here. No. We need to action that, and we need to be the leaders that our children need us to be. We need them to show us the way, I think. And that was something that obviously did not happen when we were growing up. You know, I was told, I'm the adult, you're the child. Yeah. And of course we need...
Children should be seen and not heard. Exactly. I grew up with the same...
Exactly, that was it. But I think now, you know, we're realising that children are very intelligent and they see the world through innocent eyes and are able to offer us a perspective that we have shut out. Why not use that to our advantage to create a society where everybody feels as though they genuinely do belong? But that only happens if we're willing to put our own biases
Challenge
aside
our
and to
own,
say,
yeah.
okay, why am I getting so anxious or uptight about what someone from the younger generation is saying to me?
Because there is a lot of, it's almost terror at a senior level of this. We have crossed an inflection point. We are in a period of disruption.
Yeah.
Societal norms have changed, and we have senior leaderships inside companies that still are clinging on to old-fashioned, outdated ideals of hierarchies.
Yeah.
When you go into companies, because you work with companies, what are you seeing? Is the conversation changing, or are you still coming up against those that old guard, shall we say?
The conversation is changing, which
Yeah.
is fantastic, but certainly in the work that I do around disability inclusion in particular, there's still a lot of tokenism. So let's get Jess in to come and talk, and we'll tick that box and we'll take a photo. Fantastic. So is that frustrating? Yes and no. I've also had to learn that there's always the first step.
Yes.
And if I can be part of that first step to help educate and to help open doors to what those next steps might look like, and to be able to support organisations on how they might go about that, how we can actually change policies and procedures to ensure that disability isn't something separate. It's part of this entire conversation around mental health,
Yeah.
around diversity and inclusion. But I do think that we have a long way to go. However, it's just like any other issue that we're facing at the moment. I need to be part of that conversation if I want to implement change.
Yeah.
And I do think that conversation is the beginning of all of that. And so, if I can go into an organisation and simply share my story,
Yeah.
and to share parts of this as a way to inspire teams, I then think the conversations that come from that allow organisations to say, well, yeah, why can't we broaden our horizons? Why can't we see that there's a benefit in investing in our people and making sure that our talent pool is broader so
Yeah.
that we're able to offer those perspectives within the workplace? Because it's not just for people with a disability who want to work. It's creating a culture that says, we welcome everybody. We
Yeah.
genuinely do.
Yeah.
And the benefit that then has on other employees who feel, and especially younger employees who we know want that. They want to be part of an organisation that practices what they preach.
Yeah.
So I think at the moment we're just in that sort of limbo stage of there's a lot of preaching. Now we have to see that come to fruition.
Into action. Tell me a little bit about your children's books and being a children's author. Where did that come from?
I stood in a bookstore when I was pregnant with my daughter who's about to turn 8, and I realised that there was such a lack of diversity in the characters that I saw on the bookshelves. And, it took me back to my own childhood. There was all the Disney stories and the fairy tales, which are wonderful, and they are great for imagination and for, enticing children to read. But I thought what I missed was being able to read about somebody that looked like me,
Yeah.
or that had those same experiences as me. And so I decided to write a book about a little girl with one arm on her first day at school and experiencing what it feels like to be different and to be laughed at and teased in a way that is sort of innocent from a child's perspective, but something that so many young children understand and experience. And so I wrote the first book, Jessica Goes to School, and then realised that there was other experiences that I had in my childhood that would be relevant and that so many other kids could relate to, whether or not they had a disability or not.
Yeah.
And so the second book, Jessica Goes Swimming, is about my first race and what it felt like to win and to challenge the stereotypes of others, around me. And then the third book is Jessica Joins a Band, and it's about when I was in music class and thinking, oh my goodness, what instrument can I play? And the power of having a teacher who said there are plenty of instruments you can play with one arm. And that was the piano, the trumpet, which I did not excel at. And my parents were like, no, put it away. But also the drums.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is, the story about playing the drums and how I learnt this particular beat, and knowing that I think it's the drummer in
Def
Leppard who has one hand. And so it was a beautiful way of being able to articulate the same message that I, walk into a corporate organisation and, a room full of executives and say, this is what we need to be working on. But for me, it was looking at my own children and thinking, what's the legacy? But also, how can I instill this same message around acceptance with a much younger audience in a fun way that just is about telling a story and reading a book and being able to invite young children to be part of that conversation. And they are my favourite audience because the questions they ask are beautiful, what happened to your arm? And often when I tell them I was born like it, they're so bored. They're like, oh, yeah, really? But also going into schools now, and the children are not afraid or fearful. I definitely had that at periods probably 10, 15 years ago where everyone's like, oh, my goodness, that lady's only got one arm. Now it's like, oh, this is really cool. She's only got one hand. And I do often use a robotic hand as well, which is charging at the moment as we do this interview. But that has allowed a different conversation with the younger generation, a conversation about technology, a conversation about that is so cool that you are so different and we want to be like you.
Yeah. Why haven't I got a robot on too?
Exactly. And often they'll ask that. They're like, can I have something like that? And to see that has changed. I mean, that is so beautiful and so wonderful.
My daughter still, because you spoke at her school and she still talks about, she was telling me, oh yeah, she was telling me how you do the press ups and you use the ball to do your press. Yeah. So she, it had a real impact on her as well. So
and so I think with the children's books, it's just for me another opportunity to be able to share that story. Yeah. But with young children, it's just beautiful because they genuinely don't see diversity and difference the way we do. And I think as adults, we have to be very, very careful of how we act and what we say because they're always listening and they form their judgments based on that.
Learning that every day.
Every day.
When I asked you to be a judge for the Mentl Awards 2023, a bit more brand awareness there, you just instantly said, Scott, I'm in.
Yeah.
Why?
Because it's so important. And I see the need for that as, someone with a lived experience, but also somebody working across various industries and even within the community of people with a disability. Mental health is a huge issue that needs to be addressed because, as you said, you talk about inclusion or exclusion. Within different minority groups, that takes a massive toll as well. Yeah. And so it's all enmeshed. It's all part of the same thing. And so for me, if I can embrace other organisations and, encourage people to highlight what's going on in the workplace and to be able to acknowledge that, I think, it's very important because then people are able to see, this is validating something positive, something around mental health, and it's shining a positive light on that, because I think probably, historically there's been too much of the negative conversation around, what is bad and what needs to be done more from a clinical sort of perspective. But if we can go into organisations and champion what is happening and champion organisations that are trying very hard to be able to, and are actually doing that, have implemented these changes to create a culture where people feel psychologically safe, we need to do that and we need to do more of that. So, I'm honoured and privileged to be part of this process.
We're honoured and privileged to have you as one of our judges. Thank you for that. Last question. You've been very generous with your time. I could sit here and talk to you all day. But looking at the world today, what frightens you? What excites you?
Oh, as a mother, everything frightens me. I'm excited by the conversations of the younger generation who challenge my way of thinking. And the reason I'm excited by that is because I know that my children will be able to talk more freely about issues that I wasn't able to talk freely about. But that also frightens me as well because it's a level of something unknown for me. What happens if they're not supported when they start to talk about these particular issues? And so that's why obviously the work we're doing is so important. Frightened of AI and frightened of, some parts of technology and wanting to make sure that my children feel safe and protected and have enough vulnerability and self-esteem to make choices and decisions that will keep them safe throughout their life.
And that's fun. No, I mean, I get, because again, we look at the kids and I feel for Gen Z and I feel for Gen Alpha coming after, because I grew up in a world without social media. Yeah. I grew up in a world without 24/7 WhatsApp. the pace of life today for our kids entering the world of work, you know, and I was not depressed, but just so impacted by a recent campaign by Dove, which was talking about our kids. You know, we're talking about eating disorders. We were talking about how addicted to social media they are. I mean, there's so many things that they've got to navigate that we didn't, and we struggled.
Yeah.
You know, and that's the thing, we struggled
Exactly.
without these additional pressures. So, yeah. But back to something else that excites you. Let's finish on a positive note.
I'm excited about, as my my youngest child is 3, so I have a 7-year-old, a 5-year-old, and a 3-year-old, and I'm excited about family life. I'm excited to go on this journey with them and try and, you know, figure that out as a parent, as a friend, and try and...
It's great ages as well, isn't it? Because
it's wonderful.
They're all becoming themselves every day.
Exactly. And the personalities between the 3 are so incredibly different. But I feel that, you know, as a parent who has had not much sleep over the last 8 years, I'm sort of getting over that little hump. And I'm able to watch their personalities flourish. And I don't know. I'm really excited for
I've got a 22-year-old and a 16-year-old as well as a 7-year-old. You ain't going to get that much sleep. It never stops.
No, true. Okay, the bigger they are, the bigger the problems, as I've heard.
Yeah.
But, you know, I think in terms of, like, you know, professional, aside from family life, it's really focusing on the books, because I do feel that the conversations I can have with children are what is going to make me feel as though I've contributed. And, you know, that's a selfish thing as well, of course, but it really does fulfill me knowing that those stories are being read across the world.
If parents are watching this or listening to the podcast, where can they get hold of the books?
The books are available online and in all bookstores across the UAE. So,
Brilliant. And then for companies and organisations, how do they reach out to you?
If you go to my website, which is jessicasmith.com.au, you can contact me through there.
Brilliant.
Fantastic.
Jessica, thank you so much for being a guest on the podcast today, and also for being a judge on the award. If you've enjoyed this conversation as much as I have, please remember you can subscribe on any of the podcast channels or subscribe to our YouTube channel. And if you want to find out more about the Mentl Awards 2023, and you really should, if you're doing great work that's helping people thrive, that's tackling the stigma of mental health, we want to hero you. So come to mentl.space, mentl.space, or check out the link in the show notes. Jessica, one last time, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.